Institute of Latin American Studies Cuba program, I want to welcome you to the conference, Cuba-US Working Together Again, Lessons from Environmental Cooperation. This conference is co-sponsored, in addition to Colombia, by the Environmental Defense Fund, represented here by Dan Whittle, the American College of Environmental Lawyers, represented here by David Ferrer, and the Fundación Antonio Núñez Jiménez FAN, represented aquí, I'm going into Spanglish, by Liliana Núñez Vélez, as well as Josiel Marrero, who will be moderating the last session. The first two sessions will be moderated first on history and context, Daniel Whittle. And secondly, the second roundtable will be actions and strategies. And the third will by David Ferrer, and the third will be Josiel Marrero, focusing on recommendations for the future. I now want to introduce Gretchen Sanchez Higueras, who will explain to the audience how to connect up to the simultaneous interpretation. Gretchen.
I will encourage all the audience to type the questions in the Q&A chat box. So we have only one chat box because actually we have two, and sometimes we receive questions through the chat box instead of the Q&A window. So please, I think that it's better if you use only the Q&A window for posting questions.
Okay. Thank you. Dan Whittle.
Great, thank you, Meg, and thank you, Gretchen, and thank you, Institute of Latin America Studies, for hosting this. Thanks to my colleagues at the Foundation of Antonio Núñez Jiménez and the American College of Environmental Lawyers. So sorry for the delay, everyone. We're just going to jump in right here. Our panel number one will focus on history and context for environmental dialogue and cooperation. So I'm going to start and give some remarks, and then I'll introduce the panelists one by one. So let's go back to Valentine's Day 2015. A team of Cuban and American scientists went fishing for sharks off the north coast of Cuba, setting out from Cojimar, the small town where Hemingway kept his boat. Specifically, they were hoping to catch a rare long-fin mako, put a satellite tag on it, and then monitor and study its movements and behavior. They got lucky. After 10 hours of nothing but rough seas, a large adult longfin male finally took the line and nearly capsized the boat. But in the end, the scientists and crew wrestled the shark onto the boat just long enough to tag it and let it go. Turns out the longfin makos are long distance travelers. After leaving Cuba, the shark swam the Gulf Stream to the Bahamas and then circled back to Florida into the Gulf of Mexico, where it spent several weeks. It then headed back out to the Bahamas, up the Atlantic coast of the US, reaching New Jersey in late June, before swimming back south again. The tag came off in the open ocean later that summer, about 125 miles east of the Chesapeake Bay. So longfin makos are highly migratory, and like many other species of fish and marine life, they travel freely across political boundaries. They don't need passports or visas, unlike some of us. But they aren't immune from whims of politicians and policymakers either. Consider now the massive BP oil spill off the coast of Louisiana in April 2010. Many of you remember that, I'm sure. It was the worst ocean oil spill in history. And for nearly 3 months, more than 200 million gallons of oil. Cuba, which was threatened by the spill, was on high alert for months. Though Cuba has some of the best environmental laws on the books, its hands were tied when it came to protecting itself from pollution across the border. What made Cuba especially vulnerable was the lack. They had no effective way of communicating with the US counterparts, about this oil spills movements or to coordinate in responding to it and curbing its impacts. In other words, they couldn't simply call the US Coast Guard and ask for information or help. Likewise, in the event oil were to enter its waters, Cuba couldn't count on help from the US government or from private sector companies to help contain the oil. US law prohibited response teams from entering Cuban waters. As it turns out, US-based NGOs like Environmental Defense Fund, Ocean Doctor, and others served as unofficial channels of information throughout the crisis. It took more than 18 months until the two governments found a way to talk to each other about how to deal with future oil spills. And those talks might never have happened at all had people in Florida not expressed concern about Cuba's own plans for offshore oil drilling off its northern coast. An offshore spill in Cuba could have devastating effect on Florida's Keys and on the southeast coast of Florida. So it's never been any secret to Cuban and American scientists that our two countries are connected. They've been finding ways to study that connectivity together literally for decades. Scientists and conservationists have persevered even when it's been hard to get government permission to travel back and forth, difficult to secure funds, and almost impossible to secure permits for field research. The last 2 years of the Obama administration was a turning point. Cuban scientists could once again get visas to attend meetings in the US. US non-governmental organizations, NGOs, no longer needed to apply to the Department of Treasury for specific licenses every year. Instead, they could travel to Cuba to conduct projects under the auspices of general licenses. Exports of gear, research equipment, and other materials became much, much easier to do. And government agencies began talking to each other and began working together on a suite of shared environmental problems, from climate change to overfishing, the loss of biodiversity on the land and in the sea. And in one case, government and academic scientists from both countries even got in the water together. You may hear about this more from Patricia Gonzalez at the University of Havana. But in 2017, a team of Cuban and American scientists spent a month circumnavigating the island, exploring Cuba's diverse deep water coral reefs that had never been explored, and discovering new species of marine life. It's very, very cool. Let's go back to the longfin mako. Though joint research on sharks had occurred, simply would have been off limits. Several months after we tagged the longfin, some of the same scientists worked together to prepare Cuba's first ever national plan of action for sharks, an ambitious roadmap for rebuilding the almost 100 species of sharks in Cuba's waters. 100 species of sharks. That's nearly 20% of the world's 500 species of sharks. After the National Plan of Action was published, shark experts from around the world said that Cuba's plan was one of the best they had ever seen. As I noted, the BP oil spill of 2010 exposed the dangers of not communicating or cooperating on shared environmental problems. That was the issue that really showed the world that we're connected. In 2011, EDF partnered with an industry group in Houston, the International Association of Drilling Contractors, to organize a trip to Cuba for members of Obama's Oil Spill Commission, including the commission's co-chair, former EPA Administrator William Riley. In 2013, EDF partnered with the Council on Foreign Relations to organize a second trip with Riley. And this trip included former Florida Governor Bob Graham, who is the other co-chair of the commission. These non-official delegations laid the groundwork for official multilateral discussions on oil spills and eventually for direct talks between the US and Cuban governments. In January 2017, at the tail end of the Obama administration, the two governments signed an unprecedented bilateral agreement to work together to prevent and respond to oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico. So all in all, over a period of 15 months, from November 2015 to January 2017, the US and Cuba signed 23 bilateral agreements. The first two pledged cooperation on environmental protection, and conservation of natural resources and biodiversity. And no fewer than 10 of the 23 agreements addressed environmental issues of some kind. Should note that the 23 agreements still stand today, they're still valid, but over the course of the Trump administration, governmental action under most of those agreements really just came to a halt. So they're there, they're not, invalidated, but not much has happened. US-based NGOs and academic institutions have continued cooperative projects with Cuban colleagues, but under an ever-growing number of new and cumbersome measures aimed at limiting travel and the transactions we need to carry out the work. So slowly things have just gotten harder and harder, not to mention the pandemic, which has really caused everything to stop. With a new administration in Washington, there are new opportunities to not only return things to the way they were in 2017 and to resume implementation of the agreements, but also to deepen and expand constructive engagement on a wide range of issues of mutual concern for the benefit of people in both countries. And for those who haven't already read it, I recommend the detailed report put together by the Washington Organization on Latin America and the Center for Democracy in the Americas, entitled The US and Cuba, a New Policy of Engagement. That report also included detailed recommendations on environmental cooperation. I also commend to you the report put out last week by the Cuba Study Group entitled US-Cuba Relations in the Biden Era. Both are really excellent roadmaps for how to get things back on track. And I'll also note that in December of last year, Environmental Defense Fund and 14 other US-based NGOs sent a letter to the transition team specifically addressing ways to improve environmental and scientific cooperation. And we highlighted 4 areas of action, which I'll go through real quick. Number 1, initiate a climate-focused dialogue with the Cuban government to identify priority areas for continued cooperation and collaboration on environmental protection, resource management, and biodiversity conservation among not only government agencies, but non-governmental organizations, academic institutions, and the private sector. Number 2, include Cuba in a regional climate-focused dialogue, develop and advance a coordinated Caribbean and Latin American strategy for addressing climate change and ocean health. Number 3, implement the existing bilateral agreements on environmental protection. Number 4, include Cuba in Biden's planned clean energy export and climate investment initiative to promote and help promote Cuba's development of clean energy and to support Cuba's climate change mitigation strategy. So that's a little bit of background from my perspective. On the panel this morning, we will discuss the history of dialogue and cooperation between Cuba and the US on a wide range of topics, including sustainable and small-scale agriculture, biodiversity conservation, clean energy, reforestation, overfishing, marine pollution, management of coastal zones, and climate change. And in my opinion, it's fair to say that in one way or another, it's all about climate change. If our 2 countries can commit to working together to combat climate change and the economic, social, and environmental impacts of it, then there's simply no limit to future opportunities for collaboration. By looking at the history of environmental cooperation, we can get back on track and begin to see a path forward. So on that note, we're going to kick our panel into high gear. And again, the way we'll do it, we'll go through each of the presentations, and please put your questions in the box. We'll open it up for Q&A and discussion at the end of, I think, the 7 presentations. So I'm honored to hand it over to one of our co-hosts, Liliana Nunez Veliz. She's the president of the Antonio Nunez Jimenez Foundation for Nature and Humanity, Cuba's leading environmental education and conservation organization. In 2004, she participated in the United Nations Regional Assembly on Women in the Environment. She also participated in the UN's Global Women's Assembly on the Environment and Women as the Voice of the Environment in Nairobi. She's led Cuba's delegation to the IUCN, to the International Union for Conservation of Nature in Thailand in 2004, in Barcelona in 2008. And this is an international network of conservation efforts, and the foundation is Cuba's lead for that. She's also participated in a number of other conferences, including the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, Rio +20, and many, many other things. I've worked with Liliana for a long time, and I just have to say she is widely considered as the driving force for conservation in Cuba. So it's a real pleasure, Liliana.
Muchísimas gracias, Dan, por esta presentación. Es un placer estar con ustedes y muy buenas noticias que nos dan con esa petición, ese listado de recomendaciones al grupo de transición. Y me parece muy completa. Quería, antes de empezar mis palabras, agradecerle a Environmental Defense Fund y especialmente a ti. Yo voy a hacer un recuento de los 26 años de trabajo de la Fundación en las relaciones con Estados Unidos, que puede dar un panorama de lo que la Fundación le interesa seguir y, bueno, un ejemplo de lo que desde la sociedad civil estamos haciendo. Primero, quiero agradecer al programa Cuba del Instituto de Estudios Latinoamericanos de la Universidad de Columbia, al Colegio de Estados Unidos de Abogados Ambientalistas y a Environmental Defense Fund por esta iniciativa a la que la Fundación se honra en sumarse. La Fundación, bueno, muchos de ustedes saben, es una organización cultural, científica, civil, no gubernamental y sin fines de lucro. Nos creamos en el año 94 por una cultura de la naturaleza con el propósito de armonizar a la sociedad y su entorno. La Fundación en general se ha caracterizado dentro del abanico de la sociedad civil cubana por implementar una visión integral del desarrollo sostenible y de la protección ambiental. Por más de 20 años hemos intentado implementar una agenda colaborativa con un amplio espectro de contrapartes de Estados Unidos, que ha incluido fundaciones, asociaciones profesionales, instituciones ambientales, universidades e institutos de investigación.
Muchas gracias a Liliana Núñez. Suscribo casi palabra a palabra lo que ella expuso y eso también me permite abreviar en algunas ideas. Yo envié hace unos días y sé que Gretchen lo circuló mis notas para la reunión. Por tanto, yo no voy a ir al detalle. Solamente quiero enfatizar en 7 ideas. Hay toda experiencia previa que ha probado ser provechosa, que ha probado ser efectiva. Esta experiencia previa ha demostrado la utilidad binacional de esta cooperación. No hay que reinventar la rueda. Tal vez lo que podemos añadir ahí es que podemos agregar a esas acciones la visión del valor global de esa cooperación. Las condiciones ambientales globales se han seguido deteriorando en materia climática, en materia de biodiversidad y en otras áreas, de manera que los esfuerzos que estamos haciendo pueden mirar no solo a los intereses binacionales, que estaba siempre como un objetivo claro en la cooperación, sino también a la manera en que esto contribuye a lo global. El segundo punto es la fragilidad. Lo que ha pasado en los últimos años, que estamos ahora tratando de recuperar, demuestra que la cooperación es frágil. No hay nada que nos prevenga a futuro de un retroceso en esta cooperación. Por tanto, tenemos que buscar en lo posible blindarla, hacerla más sólida, hacerla más resiliente, usando palabras climáticas. Y eso implica también generar transformación en las leyes, porque este sistema que hemos empleado por su practicidad de mover adelante acciones a través de decisiones ejecutivas es igualmente reversible. Entonces hay que llevar el trabajo a unas medidas más profundas que modifiquen los marcos legales, lo cual en definitiva implica la remoción del bloqueo. Lo tercero tiene que ver con el escenario nacional, porque el escenario nacional de Cuba es muy dinámico. Cuando ahondemos después de estos encuentros en las oportunidades de cooperación, vamos a ver un escenario nacional donde las políticas públicas confirman el valor que se da a la cooperación internacional, confirman la protección del medio ambiente y la sostenibilidad como metas del país Y esto es importante porque en este intervalo hemos tenido la crisis del COVID-19 y las políticas que el país ha puesto en vigor como...
We will give him a minute to regroup. And I'll just, while we're waiting, I'll sort of reiterate a couple of the points he's making and he made in his briefing paper. And that is, one is on the fragility of the relationship. During, from 2014 December to 2017, we saw a dramatic change in US policy toward Cuba, and it was exclusively done as a result of executive action by the executive branch, by the president, without any action really at all from Congress, other than, in many cases, a lot of bipartisan support. A lot of members of Congress were very supportive of what President Obama was doing, but they were not willing to come together and pass laws that would rescind the embargo or rescind other restrictions. So everything really depended upon executive action. What groups are now calling President Biden to do is to use that same authority, executive authority, to reverse the negative orders of the Trump administration and get things back on track. But I think what Orlando is saying and what many of us in this country are saying is we need a more resilient solution. We need a more lasting solution. And that really calls upon Congress to act and to do something more permanent. So we're not subject to the whims of a new administration every 4 years. There is some debate over whether the executive has more authority to act. There's been a compelling legal argument that that's true, but even if President Biden were to go further and say rescind the embargo, a future president could use that same authority and put it right back. So we need something resilient. Ultimately, we really need to call upon the Congress to act. Then the other point he made, which is really, really important in the case of Cuba, is their embrace in the Constitution itself of international cooperation in all spheres, but particularly in climate, in the environment. And we see that dedication. We've seen that dedication, in my case, over 20 years of working in Cuba. We've seen a real sort of open door when it comes to international cooperation, including and especially with the US, which was a big surprise to me when I started working there, was just how receptive they were to a relationship based upon mutual respect. Orlando Ray is, I think, the first person I met in December of 2000. So I'm glad to hear that he's emphasizing those same points. So I don't think Orlando's back. So I think we will give him a chance to finish his remarks when he gets back. In the meantime, I think we'll go ahead and have Patricia join us. If you're here, Patricia, let me cue you up here. Yes. Okay. So Patricia Gonzalez is a professor and former director of the Center for Marine Research at the University of Havana. She's a member of the Marine Ecology Group at the center and international chair for coastal and marine studies in Cuba. She's an advisor to the Hart Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies, Texas A&M and Corpus Christi. And okay, that's better. And an affiliate faculty member at the University of Vermont. And I know from personal experience, she's one of Cuba's foremost experts on the ecology of coral reefs and has extensively studied natural and man-made impacts on corals. She's published extensively and was one of the principal organizers behind a special Cuba issue for the Bulletin of Marine Sciences in 2018. And that issue was especially important because it ended the University of Miami's decades-long policy of not publishing Cuban authors. And in fact, the Miami Herald said that was the end of the academic embargo when the University of Miami decided to publish an entire issue dedicated to Cuban science. And then Patricia Gonzalez was really the force behind that. So welcome, Patricia, and thank you.
organizadores de este evento por haberme dado la oportunidad de compartir algunas experiencias de las que hemos tenido desde el Centro de Investigaciones Marinas en la colaboración entre Cuba y Estados Unidos. Primero que todo, yo quisiera enfatizar que la colaboración en las ciencias marinas entre Cuba y Estados Unidos es algo que se remonta hace prácticamente 2 siglos atrás. Sin embargo, en los últimos años de la década de los 90 e inicios de la década de los 2000, esa colaboración se enriqueció mucho más y realmente se expandió hacia otras áreas de las ciencias marinas que hasta ese momento no habían sido investigadas de conjunto. Y además grupos de investigadores de diferentes organizaciones comenzaron a trabajar de manera mucho más estrecha, ya como grupos de investigación, como proyectos escritos desde ambas partes. Una de las motivantes de esto fue precisamente el estado natural en que se encuentra todo el Gran Caribe y el Golfo de México, en términos de contaminación, en términos de los efectos del cambio climático, etc. Pero también las tecnologías ayudaron y contribuyeron mucho, como decía Dan al inicio, en verificar y tener las evidencias de que estábamos compartiendo muchas de las especies con alto valor o natural o comercial. Ese es el caso, por ejemplo, de los tiburones, ese es el caso de las tortugas, pero inclusive pudimos comprobar en aquellos primeros años de la década de los 2000 que inclusive, contrario a lo que se pensaba desde el punto de vista científico hasta ese momento, que los organismos migraban siguiendo la corriente del Golfo, pues se pudo comprobar que incluso habían manatí que lo que hacían era el recorrido de migración exactamente a la inversa, o sea, desde la Florida y hacia las costas noroccidental cubanas. Todos esos elementos, pues al final generaron muchas hipótesis de investigación y nos dimos cuenta desde ambas partes que había un vacío de conocimiento fundamental que teníamos que estudiar de conjunto y también teníamos que manejar de conjunto. Realmente en aquellos años iniciales me gustaría destacar mucho el rol, sobre todo de dos ONGs, una de ellas The Ocean Foundation y la otra EDF, Environmental Defense, que realmente fueron cruciales en comenzar esas investigaciones de conjunto. Y algo que también quiero destacar es que esa relación no solo se basó en la investigación, sino también hubo un área fundamental y es precisamente la formación de capacidades, la formación de estudiantes en problemáticas comunes dentro del Golfo de México y el Gran Caribe. Como parte de esto, yo solo, en aras de no extenderme en el tiempo, quisiera resaltar 3 ejemplos. Uno, Dan lo adelantó cuando mencionaba la investigación que hicimos en los arrecifes mesofóticos en el año 2017. Realmente hasta ese momento poco se conocía de los arrecifes mesofóticos cubanos. Y esa fue la primera investigación conjunta donde se circunnavegó toda la isla de Cuba y realmente se pudieron comprobar la conectividad que existía oceanográfica, ecológica y genética. Un segundo ejemplo es el caso que Dan también adelantó, el caso del Bulletin of Marine Science. En los últimos 60 años, una de las revistas a las que muchos investigadores cubanos habían intentado acceder y no habíamos podido es precisamente el Bulletin of Marine Science. Esa es una revista científica de muy alto prestigio académico, pero que además sobre todo publica trabajos que tienen que ver directamente con el contexto en el cual nosotros nos encontramos, o sea, el contexto del Golfo de México y el Gran Caribe. Y sin embargo, a pesar de que los temas que nosotros intentábamos publicar desde Cuba eran totalmente pertinentes a las revistas y los editores así nos los hacían saber, pues había una interpretación de las leyes del bloqueo que impedían que nosotros trabajáramos, o sea, publicáramos en esa revista. A mi modo de ver, el hecho de que comenzáramos a publicar ahí. Yo creo que lo más significativo fue que gracias a la voluntad, al coraje y a la energía de Dan Whittle y Joseph Roman de la Universidad de Vermont, se elaboró un volumen completo de esa revista dedicada a Cuba. Y algo realmente que yo aprecio mucho en el plano personal es que la inmensa mayoría de los artículos están escritos por colegas cubanos y colegas norteamericanos. Ello dice mucho de que cuando llegamos a la publicación de esa revista ya habían muchos años anteriores de trabajo conjunto, había mucho avance en nuestras investigaciones conjuntas y gracias a ello se pudieron plasmar esos resultados en ese volumen. Y el último ejemplo que quiero poner, anteriormente me refería a que si bien las investigaciones han sido y son muy provechosas y útiles, no solo yo diría para ambos países, sino para toda la región, hay un aspecto que es fundamental y es la formación de los jóvenes investigadores. Y en ese sentido hemos tenido toda una gama de cursos diferentes, desde estudiantes norteamericanos que vienen a Cuba, estudiantes cubanos que van a los Estados Unidos, profesores que también van y vienen desde ambos lugares, y algo que es también crucial, sobre todo en el contexto cubano actual, son cursos que venimos dando, y voy a poner este ejemplo porque ha sido de los más fructíferos, con Environmental Defense sobre gestión pesquera sostenible. Eso en el contexto cubano actual realmente es de mucha utilidad porque gracias a esta organización hemos podido invitar a profesores de muy alto prestigio, no solo estadounidenses, sino también chilenos, por ejemplo, mexicanos, que han venido a Cuba a ofrecer esos conocimientos y nos hemos asegurado de que vengan hasta La Habana estudiantes de prácticamente todas las provincias del país. Son cursos muy grandes que no solo abarcan temas teóricos, sino teórico-prácticos, y donde se le enseña a los estudiantes cómo llegar hasta de verdad tener una gestión pesquera sostenible. Eso yo creo que es una contribución al conocimiento, pero también es una contribución al desarrollo de nuestras alternativas económicas actuales. Lamentablemente, el año pasado, debido a la COVID, no pudimos desarrollar una edición más de ese curso, pero realmente es algo que nos piden no solo los estudiantes, sino también nos piden sus propios directivos, nos piden los manejadores, que esos muchachos jóvenes continuemos formándolos en esos temas. De manera que yo suscribo totalmente lo que decía no solo Dan, sino también Orlando Rey, sobre la necesidad de continuar esta colaboración, porque yo creo que el beneficio es mutuo, el camino es único, y por eso también decía, o el título de mi presentación era que el mar lo vemos como un puente continuo, un puente muy bien establecido, muy sólido, que nos une. Quizás en las recomendaciones al final del día sería importante ver de qué manera lo que podemos es tratar de solidificar aún más esa colaboración, o tratar de ver cómo en tiempos que no soplen los mejores aires, nosotros podemos seguir con nuestras velas izadas y nunca dejar de navegar de conjunto. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Patricia. The Center for Marine Research is truly a world-class scientific and environmental education outfit. It's sort of like the Woods Hole of Cuba, or Woods Hole is like the Center for Marine Research for the U.S. And I just want to emphasize Patricia's focus on young scientists. There's just incredible enthusiasm, at the center to get in the water and to study marine biology. And there's an entire generation of future leaders that Patricia and her team are working with. So it's really exciting to see. Hopefully the course will start again next year. Orlando, we will come back to you. You were talking about Cuba's commitment to international cooperation when we lost you.
Gracias, Dan. Primero me disculpo, algo que de descubrir de Zoom y el uso del VPN es que además de las dificultades de acceso, toma todos los datos con una rapidez tremenda. Entonces estoy conectado en la casa, vació la reserva de datos que recargarme. Decía, estaba focalizando mi intervención en 7 puntos. Cuando nos adentremos en la cooperación, porque no hay dos momentos que sean iguales, vamos a un escenario nacional muy dinámico, con cambios importantes en la gestión económica, en los actores, en el esquema de dirección que se hace mucho más descentralizado, toma un papel mucho mayor lo local, el municipio pasa a tener un papel primordial, hay otras formas de organización económica, en fin, vamos a encontrar que hay un escenario muy provechoso para esta cooperación y nosotros de hecho estamos también desde el punto de vista climático buscando cómo fortalecemos ese escenario. Ahora, el tema del bloqueo que ya ha sido mencionado. Esto es clave y quiero comentar esto con mucho cuidado porque todos estamos muy conscientes de la importancia de la colaboración científica, la investigación, pero eso es un área complementaria, eso es un área tangencial a la cooperación real entre los dos países que hemos tenido que tomar por ausencia del marco normal de cooperación que se supone exista entre dos naciones. O sea, la cooperación científica debe seguir y se debe profundizar, pero hay que tratar de mover la cooperación al verdadero centro de los procesos de cooperación entre dos países en igualdad de condiciones. En ausencia de eso, siempre vamos a estar cooperando en los pequeños registros de la ley, en pequeños espacios que nos dan determinadas normas. Es una política de cooperación contra una política mayor que no favorece esa cooperación. Limita a los actores que intervienen, limita el largo plazo, limita objetivos de más aliento, objetivos más ambiciosos. Eso en el proceso y siguiendo esa misma lógica, debemos movernos más de la cooperación en lo ambiental a la cooperación en la sostenibilidad, a la cooperación en el desarrollo. Eso está bien enunciado en la carta que se envió por un grupo de organizaciones al actual presidente. Yo no la tenía en el momento que escribí mis notas, Dan me la envió el fin de semana. Cambio climático ofrece un terreno tremendo para cooperar ahí. Primero, es un terreno de conexión, porque muchas de las acciones en adaptación del cambio climático vendrán enlazadas en ecosistemas marinos y costeros, pero también da un espacio muy grande para conectar con las agendas de mitigación. Los dos países somos parte de un compromiso global renovado ahora por la actual administración americana. Los dos países tenemos objetivos nacionales de transformar la matriz energética y ahí hay un terreno muy propicio. En la carta al presidente hay algunas áreas específicas. Seguro que si se hace un diagnóstico de las oportunidades de cooperación en la adaptación y en la mitigación, podemos encontrar cuestiones muy interesantes y novedosas. Hay terrenos que ya están explorados un poco como energía o agricultura, pero podemos expandirnos a nuevos ámbitos. Y termino con un comentario que retorna al tema de la ampliación del concepto de la cooperación. El bloqueo ha sido dañino al ambiente cubano. Cuidar el medio ambiente no es solo una cuestión de proteger en determinados puntos de especial valor. Es un tema de desarrollo que requiere recursos financieros, que requiere de tecnología para resolver problemas de contaminación, para modernizar la tecnología, para salir de patrones de más alto consumo de combustible fósil y transicionar a una economía más limpia. Y eso requiere de esa cooperación más amplia y requiere entonces de que la cooperación actual en la ciencia y en la investigación se convierte en un insumo que daría la base científica para estas otras modalidades de cooperación. Estos son mis comentarios a grandes rasgos.
Thank you. Thank you, Orlando. Yeah, that was perfect. I think we lost you again, but I think you finished. And thank you everyone tuning in for your patience on the technical difficulties. A year ago, this would have been impossible. And since March, we found ways to connect virtually in ways we've never have before. I just wanted to thank you again, Orlando. And on your point of cooperation, so much cooperation has focused on environmental protection, natural resources management. And I think the point you make about cooperating on sustainability, on sustainable development is critically important. I think it's in our interest that Cuba develop sustainably. And I think there's so much more that we could do on that. Liliana mentioned RISDOC, the Research Initiative for Sustainable Development of Cuba. That's a Ford Foundation supported effort that brings people in both countries together and really around the region to discuss how to develop different sectors in a sustainable way. And there's a lot to learn from each other. So, so thanks for bringing that up. So we will continue. There'll be time for discussion, after the panelists. Our next panelist is Reynaldo Funes Monsalte, who's director of the Geohistorical Research Program at the Foundation of Antonio Núñez Jiménez and a professor of history at the University of Havana. If you haven't read his book, From Rainforest to Cane Field, A Cuban Environmental History Since 1492, you should. It's a great book and really gives you the context of environmental change over the centuries in Cuba and a look at what the challenges and opportunities are now. He just came out with a new book. I haven't read it yet, but it's called, I'm translating into English, Our Trip to the Moon, the idea behind the transformation of nature in Cuba during the Cold War. Basically an extension of the first book he wrote. For the last 5 years, Reynaldo has been a visiting professor at the Council on Latin American and Iberian Studies at Yale. And his research focuses mainly on Cuban, Caribbean, and Latin America environmental history and the history of science and technology in Cuba. So Reynaldo, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and take it away.
Bueno, thank you very much, Dan, and my colleagues and friends for this invitation. Now I will move to Spanish. And yo creo que es muy importante tratar estos temas con un enfoque histórico. Y obviamente las relaciones entre Estados Unidos tienen rutas raíces muy antiguas, ¿no? Desde la pertenencia de parte de los Estados Unidos a España, desde su administración desde Cuba, el comercio que sostuvieron ambas partes, Estados Unidos y Cuba, desde el mismo nacimiento de la nación de los Estados Unidos y de la República estadounidense. Yo creo que es muy importante tener, yo siempre pienso también, por ejemplo, que se toma poco en cuenta el hecho de que en ese momento formativo de los Estados Unidos, Cuba era el país tropical más próximo a los Estados Unidos. Y eso determinó muchas de las relaciones entre Cuba y Estados Unidos desde el ángulo, desde el punto de vista de las ventajas comparativas, ¿no? Cuba como un país tropical destinado a abastecer determinados productos dentro de la noción del colonialismo europeo, y Estados Unidos desempeñó un rol muy importante desde el siglo XIX. Es decir, desde el siglo XIX, Cuba era el principal mercado de importación de los Estados Unidos en toda Latinoamérica durante gran parte del siglo XIX, sobre todo hasta la década del 60, como mismo los Estados Unidos se fue convirtiendo en el principal mercado y el casi único mercado para el azúcar de Cuba. Así, esas relaciones tan estrechas desde el punto de vista económico y político, obviamente tenían que llevar a una relación también en los ámbitos de la ciencia y en los ámbitos de las preocupaciones ambientales. Entonces, yo escribí un paper que después lo voy a circular también, tratando de señalar algunos de los hitos de esas relaciones entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos, que empiezan desde muy temprano. Es más conocido, por ejemplo, la relación de Felipe Poey con el Smithsonian Institute en los Estados Unidos y de otros científicos cubanos, como recibieron su formación en los Estados Unidos. Toda la colaboración respecto al tema de la fiebre amarilla, la labor conjunta, porque independientemente de las disputas, de las diferencias que pueden haber existido en torno a la paternidad de la teoría de Finlay, por ejemplo, es cierto que hubo una cooperación muy fuerte en esos momentos entre médicos cubanos y médicos estadounidenses en la labor epidemiológica, que se refleja hoy día, se refleja en el trabajo conjunto durante el ébola en África, por ejemplo. Es decir, que Cuba recibió mucho de ese influjo de los médicos y de las políticas epidemiológicas de los Estados Unidos para llevar a cabo también todas esas obras de saneamiento y para confrontar la fiebre amarilla, el muermo, otras enfermedades que eran enfermedades comunes que afectaban a los Estados Unidos y afectaban a Cuba. Un hito importante en el siglo XIX, a finales, es el del surgimiento de la Sociedad Cubana Protectora de Animales y Plantas, que estuvo muy vinculada a la Sociedad Americana para la protección contra la crueldad hacia los animales, fundada por Henry Bird en Nueva York, y otras sociedades de este tipo en los Estados Unidos. Hubo una gran colaboración. Yo creo que es importante porque esto fue la primera sociedad ambientalista en la historia de Cuba, y esos vínculos ya estaban desde esa fecha. De hecho, Henry Bird, que fue el fundador de esa sociedad, Martí le dedicó un artículo, yo creo, muy interesante y muy visionario sobre la labor que estaba haciendo Henry Bird en los Estados Unidos con la Sociedad Protectora de Animales y Plantas que creó en New York. Yo creo que hay muchos puntos de contacto. Mencioné ya el de la fiebre amarilla, el de Carlos Finlay, científicos norteamericanos que vinieron a Cuba como Erastus Wilson, por ejemplo, que escribió uno de los primeros tratados sobre el saneamiento de la bahía de La Habana a fines del siglo XIX. Y luego, bueno, hay una larga historia de colaboración después de la República de Cuba, la República, sabemos, mediatizada por la enmienda Platt, en esas relaciones, lazos de singular intimidad, como se le llamaron en aquel momento por un político muy famoso dentro de los Estados Unidos, relaciones de dependencia, pero no dejaron de existir esos puntos de colaboración e intercambio. Por ejemplo, la estación de experimentación agronómica de Santiago de Las Vegas, los primeros directores fueron estadounidenses. Yo encontré, por ejemplo, Josiah Crowley, que fue uno de los directores. Yo creo que él escribió uno de los primeros artículos sobre la conservación de los recursos naturales en Cuba, presentado a la Academia de Ciencias en el año 1909. Yo creo que ese trabajo de la estación agronómica entre científicos norteamericanos y cubanos fue muy importante también en esos momentos. La formación de científicos cubanos en los Estados Unidos, de hecho estamos aquí auspiciados por la Universidad de Columbia, y yo siempre recuerdo la labor en Cuba en la geografía de Salvador Masip y Sara Isalgué. Ambos recibieron un máster de la Universidad de Columbia y mantuvieron relaciones muy estrechas con diferentes universidades norteamericanas durante mucho tiempo. Ellos fueron los maestros de Antonio Núñez Jiménez, que estaba muy orgulloso de ser los discípulos tanto de Masip como de Sara Isalgué, que fue su tutora de su tesis de la Universidad de La Habana sobre la cueva de Bellamar. Ellos, a su vez, mantuvieron relaciones muy estrechas con otros profesores de Columbia, como Edwin Rice, durante mucho tiempo en la labor de la cartografía sobre Cuba. Rice se mantuvo colaborando tanto con Masip y Sara como con otros geógrafos cubanos como Gerardo Canet o Leví Marrero también en sus libros. Es decir, ilustró muchos de estos libros, el Atlas de Cuba del año 49. Yo creo que son puntos de contacto. Algo que no podemos olvidar es el libro Los suelos de Cuba de Bennett y Allison. Yo creo que la labor de Hugh Bennett en Cuba merece ser estudiada y reevaluada por lo que implica la labor de Bennett para estos temas, tanto en Cuba como para los Estados Unidos. Sabemos que fue el que creó el Servicio Nacional de Suelos en los Estados Unidos, fue su director durante muchos años. Y yo creo que debemos mirar a estos intercambios. Bennett en Cuba, incluso, él publicó muchas de sus impresiones en otros medios, no solo en medios científicos, y nosotros debemos redescubrir esa historia de intercambio y colaboración. Él regresó a Cuba en los años 50 para asesorar en estudios más específicos dedicados a diferentes municipalidades del país, financiados por el Banfai. Y yo creo que todos estos son temas de colaboración muy importante. Queda por determinar, por ejemplo, qué tipo de intercambios se desarrollaron bajo el paraguas del llamado Punto 4, que sabemos que promovió muchos de estos temas, aplicó durante la época revolucionaria. Es decir, que independientemente que hubo una ruptura desde el punto de vista diplomático, se mantuvieron muchos de estos temas vigentes. Y el gobierno trabajó por llevar adelante muchas de esas iniciativas que se pusieron, muchas de esas recomendaciones que se pusieron en ese simposio. Aún en los momentos de una ruptura mayor desde el punto de vista diplomático podemos encontrar estos vínculos. Por ejemplo, el libro que dio inicio a ediciones revolucionarias en Cuba, después se puede explicar lo que fueron esta serie de ediciones revolucionarias, fue justamente Primavera Silenciosa, que es un libro pionero dentro del movimiento ambientalista moderno dentro de los Estados Unidos. Nosotros podemos considerar que ese libro también fue pionero en Cuba en muchos aspectos, y muchos científicos siguieron la obra de Rachel Carson durante todos estos años. Podemos continuar, por ejemplo, en los años 70, la labor de Kenton Miller en Cuba. el trabajo conjunto con científicos cubanos para crear un sistema nacional de áreas protegidas en el medio de las relaciones más difíciles, obviamente de los años 60 y del 70 en los Estados Unidos. La colaboración más directa de otros científicos, como el caso de Richard Levins, que durante muchos años vino a Cuba para asesorar en muchos de estos temas agrícolas, en temas de agroecología. Yo creo que en la historia nosotros no podemos mirar solo los aspectos, digamos, más controvertidos, que requieren más tiempo de sanación entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos, de una historia compleja, difícil, como sucede muchas veces entre países vecinos y confrontados en un contexto como el de la Guerra Fría, por ejemplo, por razones históricas, por el tema de la lucha por la autodeterminación de Cuba dentro de esas relaciones con Estados Unidos. Pero también tenemos que buscar en estas experiencias positivas que nos pueden inspirar para el trabajo, y ya ustedes han hablado mucho de esas experiencias en los últimos 30 años, como las de la propia fundación o el Centro de Estudios Marinos. Yo creo que son temas que nos pueden inspirar en este trabajo que estamos haciendo y buscar la historia cercana y la historia más remota. Y quiero terminar con algo que es evidente para muchos de nosotros. Obviamente en estos temas ambientales no es solo en una sola dirección que Cuba tiene que aprender de los Estados Unidos. También yo creo que de ese diálogo Estados Unidos puede aprender algo de la experiencia cubana. Y voy a terminar con algo que apareció recientemente en un nuevo índice de desarrollo sostenible creado, una de estas bases de datos que trata de conjugar las cuestiones sociales con las cuestiones ambientales. Cuba aparece en el primer lugar dentro de ese índice, seguido de Costa Rica, de hecho otro país de la cuenca del Caribe con una relación muy estrecha con los Estados Unidos. Pero otros países más desarrollados, como los propios Estados Unidos, aparecen en el lugar 150, 154 dentro de este índice de desarrollo sostenible. Es decir, yo estoy convencido de que en esta idea de un desarrollo sostenible low input, como el caso de Cuba, o una idea de desarrollo sostenible de high input, como los Estados Unidos, hay un montón de terreno en común del que podemos aprender mutuamente. Así que de nuevo, muchísimas gracias a ustedes y espero que la historia ambiental sea útil en este debate para todos nosotros. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Reynaldo. When will your new book be available in English?
I don't know, maybe in 1 year, maybe soon.
Okay.
By North Carolina. In fact, Hugh Bennett was from North Carolina also.
Exactly.
Yes, yes.
Looking forward to that. So again, Reynaldo has now had 2 books examining the long history of scientific and environmental cooperation between universities, academics, scientists, conservation groups, and governments. And the period between 1960, 1959, and 2014 was an exception. That's when some of the cooperation, especially between governments, stopped, but it never entirely stopped. As Reynaldo said, there's been a lot going on over the last 50 years between scientists. Scientists will never stop working together. Now there's a huge new opportunity to pick back up and really expand and deepen that cooperation. The other thing you mentioned is that it's truly a two-way street. We have so much to learn from our Cuban counterparts. That's always been the case. American scientists going to Cuba to learn from your example and vice versa. So that's the spirit of which we're talking about going forward as well. So thank you. Our next panelist is, let's see, we've got Margarita Fernandez is next, and she is, since 2015, she's been the executive director of first the Vermont Caribbean Institute, now the Caribbean Agroecology Institute, which is a small nonprofit based in Burlington that catalyzes knowledge exchange, builds capacity, and supports transitions to agroecological systems that are resilient to climate change in Cuba, in the US, and throughout the region. Prior to taking on this role, Margarita has worn many hats. She worked for 15 years in different roles as farmer, researcher, and practitioner in the sort of implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of international cooperation, where she worked as a volunteer in the urban agriculture movement in Havana. She took that experience and then did her master's degree on the benefits of urban agriculture, looking at Havana in New York City. Margarita is a good colleague. We've worked together for a
Ella es
long
una
time
buena
with
colega,
the
hemos
foundation
trabajado
on a
juntos
variety of issues, including
con la
small-scale
fundación
agriculture and learning exchanges
y
between the two
intercambios de
countries and the region.
aprendizaje entre los
So
dos
thank you,
países.
Margarita, for joining
Así
us.
que muchas gracias, Margarita, por estar con nosotros.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning,
Gracias,
everybody.
Dan.
It's
Buenos
really a
días a
great
todos.
pleasure to be here
Es
today.
un
I
placer estar
wish we
aquí con
could
todos
be in
ustedes el día de
person.
hoy. Me
Especially I
encantaría que
see so many
estuviéramos en
friends and
persona,
colleagues in the
especialmente veo
audience.
a
So
tantos
hello to everybody.
colegas. Así que
I want to
buenas
first thank the
a todos.
organizers of
Antes
this
que nada,
event for
quiero
bringing us together to
agradecer a
discuss
los
these
organizadores de este evento
important
por estar
issues.
juntos.
So my name is Margarita Fernandez. As Dan mentioned, I direct a small NGO, formerly the Vermont Caribbean Institute. We just changed our name to the Caribbean Agroecology Institute to better reflect sort of the thematic work that we do. We've been working closely with partners in Cuba for the past 15 years. Initially, we worked on arts and culture, and over the past 8 years, we've moved to focus more on environmental, agriculture, and climate change issues. Our main initiative through the Caribbean Agroecology Institute is the Cuba-Us Agroecology Network, which we formed in 2015 with the mission of connecting farmers, academics, institutions, and movements in our countries who are really dedicated to building more ecologically resilient, socially just, and economically fair farming and food systems through agroecology. So we do this by raising awareness about Cuba's agroecology advances and challenges, by facilitating partnerships and building capacity among stakeholders in the participation in exchanges, courses, conferences, workshops, and collaborative research. We also work to amplify Cuban voices internationally and to channel resources and opportunities to our counterparts on the island. So over the past 3 decades, there have been hundreds of exchanges focused on agriculture between Cuban and US farmers, alternative agriculture advocates, policymakers, and academics engaging in a variety of workshops, courses, and meetings. These exchanges have been a significant part of the relationship building between US and Cuban citizens. Collaborative research has been taking place since the early 90s, led by groups like the University of Florida, who have published widely on agriculture in Cuba, as well as Food First and University of California, Berkeley, and Harvard with Richard Levins, as Reynaldo already mentioned. Over the years, countless universities and organizations have organized courses, learning exchanges, and conducted research in collaboration with leading institutes in Cuba, including American University, University of Vermont, University of Massachusetts, University of Santa Cruz in California, to name just a few. These research collaborations have helped bridge the divide in data access, access to equipment, and publications in peer-reviewed US journals. Later, I'm gonna post in the chat a special issue that we helped coordinate, similar to the Bulletin Marine Science. It was a special issue dedicated to Cuba's agri-food systems in transition, published by Elementa Science in the Anthropocene. So I'll post that in there for those who are interested afterwards. More recently, there have been interesting examples of solidarity networks and knowledge exchange between US and Cuban farmers and farmer organizations. The longstanding relationship between Cuba's National Small Farmers Association, ANAP, and the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which is in Southeast United States, exemplifies how direct engagement between farmer organizations can benefit both Cuban farmers looking for collaborators on new farming techniques and seed varieties. For the past 6 years, CUSAN has been organizing large delegation of US farmers to attend an international conference and training organized by the Cuban National Association of Small Farmers, ANAP. Through these delegations, we've taken more than 200 farmers and farmer organizations. These events are a source of inspiration, motivation, and knowledge exchange. They've fed into grassroots farming training processes in the United States, one in particular called the People's Agroecology Process, where methodologies for training used in Cuba are translated to the US context. In addition to these learning exchanges, courses, and collaborative research, we as an institute recognize the huge need for material support to complement the very high level of human capacity in Cuba. We're lucky to have a private foundation in the US recognize this as well and commit to providing a substantial grant to our institute to facilitate the purchase and export of materials to support 2 Cuban institutions, Indio Hatue Agricultural Research Station and the Fundación Antonio Núñez Jiménez, to help build their material capacity to more successfully implement their sustainability programming around renewable energy, agroecology, and sustainable communities. We've also begun to work in a more traditional definition of development. Through an initiative we have in Eastern Cuba, working with local environment offices to facilitate and support community-based climate change adaptation, mitigation, education, and planning. Similarly, we're initiating support in partnership with the national level agriculture organization and another international NGO to implement a project for the empowerment of women farmers for improved food sovereignty and climate resilience in family farms. Despite restrictions under Trump, there were still many legal ways we all engaged. However, the most recent restrictions on travel, in particular in the professional meetings category, is a strong blow to environmental collaboration, which we have not really felt because of restrictions on travel caused by COVID. However, over the past several months, engagement has continued through online platforms like these. So why is engagement important? Obviously, as many have already said, the environmental challenges we face, the climate crisis being at the forefront, are global in nature and cannot be addressed without coordination and cooperation. For decades, many of us have been sounding the alarm that we must change the way we structure our economies and societies and our relationship to nature and to each other if we are to have a viable planet to sustain the human species. Though many of the solutions to these problems are found at the community level, this is a global threat that requires unity, collaboration, solidarity, and cooperation. We must share lessons learned and mistakes made in order to move forward together. At a national level, Cuba has been researching and planning for climate mitigation and adaptation, and their national strategy, known as Tarea Vida, can provide lessons to counterparts in the US, particularly in southeastern coastal communities. Similarly, just this past year, the Cuban government approved a national strategy for food sovereignty and nutritional education, known as Plan SAN, which aims to relocalize food systems governance and economies to the municipal level in order to build resilience, reduce waste, improve production, and diversify diets rooted in the principles of agroecology and food sovereignty. Cuba has so much to teach us, and by isolating them, we are only isolating ourselves from the opportunity to mutually learn and solve these challenges. Looking ahead, there's much to be hopeful for because of the new administration and reforms happening within Cuba, but in many ways, our challenges remain formidable. First and foremost, we must continue to push for a complete lifting of the cruel and inhumane blockade. In recent weeks, there's been a groundswell of organizations in the US, from religious, Cuban American, policy NGOs, solidarity groups, agriculture and environmental groups asking for a policy of engagement. In order to facilitate environmental cooperation, changes need to be made to travel and staffing of the embassy. Changes also need to be made on banking and financial transactions. This is really important in order to fully take advantage of the rule passed by Obama in March 2016, which is still valid, that allows for US entities to provide grants to Cuban institutions. This would greatly facilitate international cooperation in support of agriculture, food, and climate change development projects. We also hope to see the working groups reinstated on areas of mutual interest. Those focused on climate change and agriculture should be in close consultation with those of us in the NGO and academic sector who have been engaging with Cuba for a long time. So I want to end with a few words that a close friend and colleague, Mario Braunfriend, the former Forward Program Officer to Cuba, once told me, has probably told many of you on this call in the audience, that in order to work in Cuba, you need to be guided by the 3 Ps. 3 Ps are patience, perseverance, and passion. So guided by these 3 Ps, we've navigated the often treacherous political terrain of US-Cuba relations, becoming accidental diplomats, as a commitment to science and the well-being of our communities and planet bring us together to learn from each other and help overcome each other's challenges. So we look forward to continuing to work together with humility, curiosity, transparency, and respect. I look forward to talking in the discussion section. Thank you.
Thank you, Margarita. Wow, that was great. For any of you who've been on a Cuban small farm, including maybe the one of Reynaldo's brother, Fernando, it's really impressive how highly productive Cuban farmers are, how much they can grow with very few inputs, with almost no equipment and very few supplies. So imagine how much more could be done just with a little bit more material support, as Margarita was talking about. We've talked a lot about exchange, the ability to go back and forth, but we haven't talked as much about, the export of just basic, field research equipment for Patricia Gonzalez and others to get in the water, and for others, clean energy supplies, et cetera. So there's a huge opportunity, but the barricades, the barriers that Margarita was talking about are a serious impediment, to achieving those opportunities. So thank you very much, Margarita. And speaking of opportunity, our next guest, my colleague, and the last panelist for this morning, Valerie Miller, who will speak about oceans of opportunity. Valerie has been with EDF for just over 8 years. She's director of our Cuba program. She started out actually working on sharks on a tri-national shark initiative between the US, Cuba, and Mexico, and was a key part of the National Plan of Action for Sharks that the Cuba scientists and Cuban government developed. Her primary focus is on bringing people together, not just from Cuba and the US, but from Mexico, Belize, and other parts of the region to learn from each other and to take those lessons back home. It could be on coral reef conservation, sustainable fisheries management, all aspects of marine and coastal conservation. So, and finally, I'll say that Valerie was the real driving force with Patricia Gonzalez behind the university course that Patricia was talking about, that really brings together not just students, but working professionals from all kinds of different institutions and in different sectors. And so Valerie, take it away.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks everyone for putting this together. It's so good to see all of your faces, and I can't wait to be in the same place one day soon, hopefully. I'm going to talk about oceans of opportunity and highlight some recent Cuba-US marine collaboration and some future possibilities. Cuba and the US share waters and marine ecosystems. Ocean currents connect our two countries and the wider regions of the Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean Sea, and Atlantic Ocean. Our two countries also face shared environmental threats, including climate change, pollution, oil and gas development, and overfishing. Since 2000, EDF has collaborated with partners in Cuba to develop solutions on shared challenges. And over the past decade, the broader EDF Oceans program, which works around the world, has prioritized restoring fisheries in order to restore ocean health and support fishing livelihoods. The actions that the US and Cuba take to fish sustainably and to protect habitat will be mutually beneficial. Our shared environment and common threats make working together a necessity if we are to make marine conservation, including sustainable fishing, successful. I'll highlight some examples of the benefits of our nation's long history of environmental collaboration and opportunities for continued broader efforts, focusing mainly in just the last few years. As Dan mentioned earlier, one major result is that US and Cuba are now better prepared to prevent oil spills and to more effectively respond to future impacts. I'm going to focus more on coral reefs and fisheries, two areas we've worked closely together on. First, Cuba's network of protected areas across land and coastal waters is one of the most ambitious and effective systems in the Caribbean. Scientists in Cuba, including Patricia and her colleagues, have found that some coral species are more resilient to disturbances and better able to recover from coral bleaching events. In fact, a 2018 study led by scientists from the University of Queensland identified 50 coral reefs from around the world that have the best chance of surviving impacts of climate change. One of the 50 resilient reefs identified, 4 are located in Cuban waters and connect to systems across the Caribbean. These 4 reefs in Cuba, along with the Brazilian reef system, are the only ones identified as part of these 50 resilient reefs in the entire Western Hemisphere. Cuba's reefs also neighbor the Florida reef system, that's threatened by climate change and various human activities. And while other reefs in the region may also be healthy and well conserved, Cuba's reefs stand out more likely to survive the changing climate, and could potentially help repopulate neighboring reefs in the future. Cuba's success is instructive to scientists in the US who are learning from partner strategies to protect and restore coral reef ecosystems. Migratory species also connect our countries, including sharks, rays, tunas, billfish, sea turtles, and many species of seabirds. And Cuba's marine ecosystems provide habitat to snappers and other reef fishes that spawn in Cuban waters, producing larvae that travel to nearby countries, benefiting others. In 2015, Cuba became the first Caribbean island nation to enact the National Plan of Action for Shark and Ray Conservation, as Dan mentioned earlier. EDF was supporting this development of that plan and brought in experts from the US, Mexico, Australia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Canada to contribute. We were lucky to participate in a 4-year project called SOS Pesca from 2012 to 2016, where communities in Cuba became involved in science and natural resource management. Together, they found ways to fish more sustainably and to develop new economic opportunities. Cuban scientists and officials led that project with support from US, American, Italian partners, and others. Out of SOS Pesca, Cuba and US specialists published a scientific study in 2018 on the vulnerability of 34 commercially important fish species in Cuba's fishing waters. Managers are now using the results of this study to prioritize those most vulnerable species for improved monitoring and management and recovery. In 2018 and 2019, we partnered with Cuba's Center for Marine Research at the University of Havana and Patricia Gonzalez, and the Center for Fisheries Research to develop a new training program for professionals working in fisheries-related fields. Thanks, Patricia and Dan, for calling out this course. Together, we designed and implemented 2 editions of this short course on sustainable fisheries management that brought together working professionals from all over the island to join forces and draft plans to recover declining fish stocks. We hope to do another course as soon as we can get back down there, Patricia, and we'll be in touch as soon as things improve. Also, as a result of years of research and discussion stemming from this course, the Cuban government decided to protect the highly vulnerable Goliath grouper in 2018. It was an important action for the whole region, as this species is critical for coral reef health and popular with scuba diving tourism. EDF has collaborated with scientists studying the species in Cuba, and their research has been an important resource for Florida, where the Goliath grouper is also protected. And then very recently, in July 2019, Cuba's National Assembly passed the country's first fisheries law, replacing the previous Decree Law 164 from 1996. The updated legislation ushers in a new era focused on ending overfishing, recovering depleted stocks for greater food sovereignty, and strengthening the economies of coastal communities. It reflects years of work by Cuban institutions to improve science, management, and builds on lessons from many international projects. One key provision of the law is its mandate that future management measures for all species must be based on science. This aligns well with the US federal fisheries law, setting the stage for continued opportunities for exchange and collaboration between the 2 countries towards achieving sustainable fisheries that support food and livelihoods across our shared waters. Like the US, Cuban communities and ecosystems continue facing serious threats, including the growing impacts of climate change. Like our communities here, Cuba is already seeing rising sea levels and more frequent and severe storms. Yet adaptation, reduction of risk, and recovery are possible. For example, Cuba's extensive mangrove systems functions as a protective barrier for communities along the sea. It's one of the few places in the world where mangrove cover has increased in recent decades from widespread conservation and restoration efforts. International cooperation between Cuba and the US on marine conservation is already achieving results and has illustrated the importance of an ongoing collaboration and the durability of this relationship. Broader common goals provide an opportunity for expanding collaboration on science on the environment that can benefit both Cuba and the US. 2 multifaceted goals that the countries share include: 1, adopt clean energy solutions that cut greenhouse gas emissions to fight climate change, gain energy independence, and reduce air pollution from public health. And 2, adapt to climate change impacts by improving resilience in fisheries, farms, forest, energy systems, and communication systems for extreme weather events. Together, we can grow environmental collaboration to help achieve these larger common goals and involve countries throughout Latin America and the Caribbean for greater exchange and results. This resilient and broader collaboration will be key to facing future threats, especially the impacts of climate change. Notably, knowledge exchange has been occurring in some of these fields for many years, particularly around agriculture, as you heard from Margarita, and the newer collaboration, RISDOC, the Research Initiative for Sustainable Development of Cuba that Liliana and Dan mentioned, which is a coalition of Cuban and international NGOs, academics, government agencies, and others working together to advance and share knowledge on a range of issues related to sustainability, climate resilience, and Cuba's participation in the global low carbon economy. RISDOC continues to facilitate dialogue and exchange around these pressing environmental issues that are pertinent to Cuba, the US, and the larger region. Environmental collaboration between the US and Cuba provides oceans of opportunity for learning, for improving sustainable food and energy systems, which also supports growing trade and jobs in both places. Our countries cannot fully benefit from these opportunities until US policy towards Cuba changes. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Valerie. And I want to echo and highlight the report Valerie mentioned on 50 reefs. I believe the official report is coming out today or this week. And again, it highlights the 50 most resilient reefs in the world. Only 4 of them are in this hemisphere, and all 4 are in Cuban waters. One of them actually extends into Bahamian waters, and it's the site of, until about 3 weeks ago, offshore oil drilling in Bahamas waters just off the coast of Cuba. So there's a prime example of an activity that could cause enormous damage if the countries are not prepared and if they don't cooperate. We benefit greatly in this country from healthy coral reef ecosystems, and that's coral reefs themselves, seagrasses, and mangrove forests. We benefit tremendously. Our commercial fishermen in Florida benefit tremendously from healthy ecosystems in Cuba. So here's a prime example of something we can all rally around and support and invest in. So we have about 45 minutes. I encourage people to use the Q&A versus the chat. It's a little easier to follow. If you have questions of the panelists, please enter them now. This afternoon, we'll sort of shift. We'll shift a little bit this afternoon. The panel will be focused on many of the same issues, many of the same themes, but we'll look at an action agenda. Where do we go from here? What are specific partnerships, specific actions that could happen to advance environmental and scientific cooperation? We'll also hear from a bunch of lawyers. One of my very first meetings in Cuba was an exchange of American and Cuban lawyers in 2003. It was supposed to be an exchange, but at the last minute, the State Department denied visas to all of the Cuban lawyers to come to New Orleans. But we were able to go to Havana and have the second part of the exchange. So we'll hear more from the American College of Environmental Lawyers and Cuban lawyers on opportunities for professional exchanges around law and policy as well. So, and I'll also invite our panelists to jump in and ask each other questions. And I'm looking at the Q&A. So does anyone on the panel want to jump in and ask a question? And David, I see you have your hand up. You want to jump in? David Fair?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. This has been a fabulous session. This would be a little helpful for us in the afternoon, and I'm sorry, Orlando may well have been speaking about some of this, and we just couldn't get the English translation. But it would be helpful, I think, for the afternoon panel, for the American lawyers to hear a little bit more, if possible, on the embrace in the current Cuban Constitution of environmental cooperation and environmental development within Cuba. I think it would help our understanding and jumping off point for the afternoon.
Yeah, Orlando, maybe just speak a little bit more on the new Constitution and more specifically how it addresses climate change, which is a big new development, and how it encourages or speaks to international cooperation.
La nueva Constitución tiene dos elementos a considerar. Por una parte, reconoce el problema constitucional, el problema climático a nivel constitucional, pero ahí no tiene mucho más desarrollo. Y por otra parte, en el tema ambiental, introduce el derecho a un medio ambiente sano, que estaba de alguna forma implícito en la ley ambiental, pero no tenía ese reconocimiento constitucional. Eso es un cambio importante porque va a llevar a toda una serie de debates legales en la implementación de ese derecho. Cómo se accede a la justicia ambiental, cómo se reconoce ese derecho, todos los elementos que componen el derecho a un medio ambiente sano, es decir, en la participación, en la información y en acceso a la justicia. Ese es un tema por desarrollar. Hay procesos de legislación complementaria que van a fortalecer también, seguro, la actividad administrativa y judicial en estos temas y también el acceso a la información. O sea, hay en el paquete normativo que complementa la Constitución, hay una legislación específica sobre acceso a la información. Eso en cuanto a la Constitución. Como yo decía, hay cambios profundos, mucho más profundos, estructurales, en el tipo de sujetos que intervienen en las relaciones económicas, en el tipo de actividades que están potenciándose, que se realicen desde todas las formas de propiedad, e incluso en nuestra estrategia climática interna, y después yo puedo compartirle algunos documentos, estamos viendo cómo involucramos más a todos esos sectores, o sea, cómo creamos políticas climáticas desde abajo, involucrando más a los ciudadanos, a los pequeños productores, a los pequeños propietarios, a las empresas pequeñas y medianas. Es decir, es otra forma más integral de hacer, pero bueno, eso ya requeriría otra ponencia para desarrollarlo. Aquí solo hago ese comentario.
So that was great. My only other question then is when you say the right to a healthy environment, this is the right of the people to a healthy environment?
Yes, definitely. It's the right of the people.
You know, I'll just echo that the fact that there is constitutional language around climate change and some of the other issues Orlando was talking about is extremely significant and something that's not that common in constitutions, including our own elsewhere. Yeah. And we'll have, you know, more. Go ahead.
If you look at the date of the National Determined Contribution of Cuba, presented the last September, which is in English also in the site of the convention, of the Climate Change Convention, there is the language about the constitutional text on climate change.
Great, terrific. And we'll get that in the chat here in just a few minutes. But that's great. I think this afternoon, I think it would be interesting to discuss some of the issues Orlando talked about implementing the constitutional provisions on access to justice, access to information, environmental justice, et cetera. That's a very ripe and timely opportunity for exchange, I believe, two-way exchange. We've got several questions now in the chat box. I'm gonna just pick a few. There's been a question about, has there been cooperative research around the issue of coastal resilience and sustainability? So that's a good question. I would like to ask Patricia Gonzalez to take that question first, and then maybe Margarita Fernandez.
Cuando hablamos de los ecosistemas que forman parte de nuestras costas, básicamente es la conectividad entre manglares, pastos marinos y arrecifes de coral. Y luego, cómo nuestros organismos migran, por ejemplo, hacia esos ecosistemas vecinos en los Estados Unidos. donde están, por ejemplo, áreas de reproducción o hay áreas de crianza, y por la propia corriente del Golfo, entonces las larvas de muchos organismos llegan hasta las costas del sur de la Florida. En ese sentido tenemos realmente mucha colaboración, insisto, tanto desde el punto de vista oceanográfico como desde el punto de vista genético, como desde el punto de vista ecológico. Son las tres aristas que se están trabajando. Pero también hay algunas iniciativas en orden ya más social, en orden comunitario, donde tratamos de estudiar las vulnerabilidades que tienen las comunidades costeras, que en algunas ocasiones son costeras y en algunas ocasiones son de pescadores. O sea, tenemos tipos de comunidades diferentes. En el sentido de darles alternativas que les permitan a ellos hacer un manejo mucho más sostenible de sus recursos. Y esta colaboración va una vez más en dos ámbitos, una en las investigaciones per se y otra en la formación de capacidades, precisamente para poder manejar de un modo más sostenible nuestros recursos, pero también nuestras comunidades costeras.
I would like to add that there are so many communities in Houston and in other parts of the country of the US that are really focused on this because it's huge. When Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, it was devastating. And so they're struggling with all of those interconnected issues. There are legal issues, there are technical issues, there are infrastructure issues, and it is imperative that we figure out how to do this as we struggle with the underlying cause of climate change that really triggers a lot of this. But in the interim, till we solve the climate change issue, we have to have some sort of mid-course protections for coastal communities. And of course, Cuba being an island nation, at the tip of the spear, and we want to work with you to figure out how we protect all of our coastal communities all over the world.
Pam, thank you. Margarita, can you speak? There are certain things coming up around this theme. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, two things come to mind. First is the research that we're doing through the Research Initiative for the Sustainable Development of Cuba, RISDOC, which is an initiative that was mentioned by Dan and Valerie and Liliana, funded by the Ford Foundation. We're now in our 4th year. And so each year as a committee, we decide what sort of topic of need and of interest. And for this particular year, we're focusing on coastal resilience. And so we're in the beginning stages of writing a white paper with Cuban colleagues to address, not just the ecological aspect of resilience, but the economic and social and governance pieces of it as well, looking at different sectors. So agriculture, fisheries, the traditional biodiversity conservation approach. We're going to look at health. I can't remember what other, I think those are the main, energy, of course. So this is one area where we are collaborating on research. And the other is the project that we have in Eastern Cuba, which is much more about working with communities in the planning and education for building resilience and reducing vulnerability to climate change, implementing plans of action that communities can implement themselves. So I'll leave it at that.
That's great. Thank you, Margarita. This next question might actually be you too, or anyone else on the panel. There's a question about Puerto Rico and Cuba. I think they're two wings of the same bird, or there's some expression like that. But are there opportunities for more collaboration to include Puerto Rico around coastal resilience, sustainable agriculture, clean energy? Right now in Puerto Rico, of course, clean, reliable, resilient power is at the forefront of people's minds. So are there opportunities to do more with Puerto Rico? And Margarita, since you're organizing something in a few weeks, this is a good chance for you to plug that.
I can quickly address that one. It's actually, and we're working with Reynaldo Funes and Yale University. And I think it's Ramon Bueno who asked the question. He's actually participated in several of our virtual online series. It's a conference series that's going on for several months, bringing together voices from Cuba and Puerto Rico to share their responses to the climate crisis, looking at different sectors. So we've done resilience in general, we've done one on agriculture and food systems, and our next one is looking at energy. And oh, that's right, our second one was environmental history, which Reynaldo organized. And so our next one is on energy, and yeah, I mean, certainly it's a ripe sort of field of opportunities for Cuba and Puerto Rico to collaborate. So many of the issues are the same. They share the same geography, similar ecosystems, similar issues, very different relationships with the United States, but both of them have had a large impact on the trajectory of economic development in both countries. And so there's a lot to learn from each other. We've actually also brought many Puerto Rican farmers to Cuba over the past 5 years as part of our exchange program. We did one specifically looking at climate change resilience within agri-food systems and learning from each other. So yeah, it's an area where we have a lot of work to do and a lot of opportunity. And I mean, obviously EDF also has been doing a lot of work in Puerto Rico, especially on energy. And so.
Someone is asking, specifically referring to the sustainable fisheries courses that Valerie and Patricia mentioned. They are an opportunity to build upon the community-based fisheries project SOS Pesca. But in general, are you thinking about how to enhance training workshops more broadly using the digital space? In other words, using the kind of technology that we're still trying to adapt for use with Cuban colleagues. Is there, and I'll turn to Liliana and our colleagues at La Fundación, since I think you've been especially effective at identifying how to use technology to have these kinds of exchanges. But are there more plans while we're waiting out the pandemic to take advantage of the digital space to enhance trainings? So anyone is welcome. And also I'll just add, is this something that's here to stay? So even once we can begin traveling again, this is something we never were able to do. So unless you were able to travel to Cuba or they were able to travel here, it was really hard to have the kind of conversations you would normally have with partners. So anyone want to jump in here?
I can jump in, Dan.
Okay.
Thanks for the question. I think when the pandemic started, all of us, folks in the US and in Cuba, did a lot of adapting to this virtual platform, and we're figuring it out still. But I've been really impressed by the success of being able to bring people together virtually just over the past year. We haven't organized a full training course online, but we have worked with partners in Cuba, researchers focused on commercial and recreational fisheries to participate in virtual international conferences. So last August, we participated jointly in the International Marine Conservation Congress, and then in November in the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean Fisheries Institute Conference, and worked with our partners in Cuba and figured it out together. We brought dozens of folks together and jumped on a few different virtual platforms and attended these seminars and gave presentations and held small group meetings. And of course there were struggles, but it's working. And I think that's what we've always done together is just figure out how to make things work. So I'm open to doing more trainings and kind of figuring things out over the virtual platform and providing those opportunities whenever it's time and ready.
Well, let's move. We've got about 20 more minutes. I'm going to combine two questions. And Orlando or Liliana, questions for you. Number one, is there language in Cuba in the Constitution or otherwise, or discussion relating to the rights of nature as seen in Ecuador or elsewhere? So what rights does nature have? Is that a concept that's in Cuban law or policy? And then the other question related to that sort of is, what are the rights of civil society, of the public in Cuba to take a more active role in environmental conservation and environmental decision making? We saw from SOS Pesca, and we've seen from the fisheries sphere that fishermen have become much more involved in the process. It's been a more interactive and participatory. But are there other, in general, what's the landscape in Cuba in terms of the role of civil society in environmental decision making? So 2 questions: rights of nature, the other, role of the public in decision making.
Hay pocas organizaciones solamente concentradas en el tema ambiental. Pero la buena noticia es que hay muchas que aun cuando su objeto social no es primariamente el ambiental, sí llevan años tratándolo, sobre todo desde el punto de vista del impacto social del cuidado ambiental. No voy a hablar de la fundación que presido porque ya comenté. Solamente quiero resaltar lo que yo practico. O sea, la fundación intentamos hacer visible lo invisible y intentamos articular segmentos de la sociedad, del empresariado o del Estado que normalmente por su dinámica no se relacionan y sin embargo tienen un impacto muy grande en problemas ambientales. Y un factor muy importante, y es la metodología que hemos intentado desarrollar, es cómo involucrar los diálogos científicos y ambientales a las comunidades y el saber ancestral. Porque no siempre el lenguaje científico es el mismo que la dinámica de la vida cotidiana y los problemas sedimentados tienen las mismas herramientas para llegar a los decisores y tomar una incidencia real en las políticas públicas. Y ese es digamos, la brecha en la que la Fundación le interesa trabajar. Para eso tenemos que tener una excelente relación con todos esos sectores. Tenemos que armarnos de los mejores argumentos para intentar contribuir al desarrollo. Ahora, ese es el caso de la Fundación. En el caso de otras organizaciones de la sociedad civil, me gusta mucho el trabajo, por ejemplo, que hace el Centro Félix Varela. El Centro Félix Varela. Ellos vienen hace muchos años trabajando la responsabilidad social empresarial. En momentos en que eso era como hablar algo un poco extraño en el contexto cubano de los años 90. Está, por ejemplo, el trabajo magnífico que hace el Centro Martin Luther King. Ellos tienen una herramienta de educación popular donde incorporan la matriz ambiental en todos sus cursos y su capacitación. Está la organización Pro Naturaleza, que también tiene un trabajo ambiental importante. Y yo pienso que un trabajo que se ha hecho más visible en los últimos años es el de todas las sociedades científicas. De las sociedades científicas cubanas, que tienen una data de creación muy larga, Y yo pienso que han salido del trabajo investigativo y están focalizados también en el trabajo comunitario y de acompañamiento a las grandes empresas en Cuba productoras que están en manos del Estado, y también la nueva empresa que surge, la pequeña empresa que surge con el trabajador por cuenta propia o las cooperativas no agropecuarias de producción. Hay otro grupo de sociedad civil, que son las grandes, digamos, organizaciones de masa, que tienen un trabajo ambiental. Está la organización de pioneros José Martí, las brigadas técnicas juveniles, que tienen un trabajo de innovación también importante. Ahora, surge también, hay un segmento de población que está sensibilizada con los problemas ambientales y a lo mejor no están afiliadas a una institucionalidad, pero que tienen acciones también que son interesantes y muy válidas, muy puntuales, cercanas a los sitios donde viven, o al malecón extrayendo desechos sólidos en el mar. Y yo creo que, bueno, el abanico es amplio, porque amplios son los problemas también. Y unos con un sombrero más institucional, otros más dinámicos, que no dejamos de ser dinámicos los institucionales, pero tienen otra forma de operar.
Thank you, Liliana. Thank you. Orlando, do you want to add to that, to either of the two questions?
Sí, gracias, Dan. El enfoque en Cuba es del derecho al medio ambiente como un derecho humano, no como derechos propios de la naturaleza. No hay una tradición jurídica, no es nuestra tradición jurídica. Hay cierto debate interno y conozco incluso algunos abogados que favorecen la idea del derecho de la naturaleza, pero no es la posición de la Constitución, no es la tradición, y para ser honesto, yo tampoco lo comparto como concepto mucho. Sobre el tema de Liliana, quiero agregar algo y darle las gracias por la explicación que ella dio. Ella dijo algo que creo que es importante, que es la necesidad de visibilizar más muchas cuestiones que se hacen y que a veces no se difunden, y a veces también no es ni siquiera que no hagamos un esfuerzo de difusión, sino que lo que hacemos pasa por un tamiz donde algunas cosas se exacerban y otras no se divulgan lo suficiente. En materia de cambio climático, estamos haciendo proyectos, este proyecto que comentaba yo en un mail de Mi Costa, que son proyectos con intervención de las comunidades. Para hacer ese proyecto que tomó años, visitamos esas comunidades, se construyó con ellas. Es un proyecto para empoderar a esas comunidades, para que ellas mismas hagan las labores de monitoreo, de diagnóstico, de evaluación, para que allí mismo se diseñen las medidas de los que están directamente sufriendo esos impactos. Y ese es un proyecto en el que participé directamente. Hay uno similar al norte, porque este es al norte de resiliencia costera, y hay muchísimas cuestiones que se están haciendo con una amplia participación comunitaria. Liliana mencionaba otros actores. Una de los compromisos de Cuba en la contribución nacionalmente determinada de Cuba, que es en el sector porcino, para transformar la matriz energética, capturar las emisiones y convertirla en biogás, es una medida esencialmente con el sector privado cubano. O sea, hay muchas cosas que se están haciendo, y cuando a veces yo oigo los comentarios sobre el involucramiento de la sociedad civil y de la comunidad y de muchos otros participantes en la agenda ambiental y climática cubana, creo que también está asociado a vacíos de conocimiento, a vacíos de información. Nosotros tenemos que hacer mejor vitrina de esas cosas, venderla mejor, pero también depende de donde se recibe y donde se discrimina la información nuestra muchas veces, escogiendo qué está bien o mal según determinadas visiones de lo que nosotros hacemos.
Great, thank you, Orlando. Thank you, Liliana. We have several more questions. We just have a few more minutes. One question is we've talked a lot about the environment, protecting the environment. What about protecting the quality of life in cities, the urban environment? So what programs are in place? What initiatives are in place to focus on the urban environment? And there was also in the New York Times, I think last week, a story on water supply, water treatment, water infrastructure in Cuba, and some of the serious need to upgrade the infrastructure to secure clean, drinkable water. Infrastructure is a major issue in this country as well, so we know that problem. But so does anyone want to talk about the urban environment and possibly the issue of water?
You know, when you'll be hearing this afternoon, we were to have had a conference with the foundation last March in Havana. And when we were organizing it and in discussion with Liliana and Josiel, one of the critical issues that Liliana had brought up as a concern was urban trees. And wanting to know what the US approaches were on trying to protect urban trees against damage or destruction. And I'm wondering, Dan, whether we might hear about what laws or regulations at the local or national level either are or could be put in place in Cuba. And that, again, might help as a jumping off point for part of our discussion this afternoon.
I wanted to point out that, I think there's a lot of collaboration opportunities moving forward on both urban and non-urban communities facing the risk of climate change. And I can't remember if it's already been described by the other panelists, but Cuba's Tarea Vida project, Project Life, is, I think, an example for many places across the region that focuses on using long-term scenario planning and science to guide community planning for the future, and supporting the most vulnerable communities that are facing sea level rise and coastal climate change impacts to adapt or relocate if needed. And there's communities, Pam mentioned Houston, but New Orleans and communities across Florida and our coastal regions that are going to be dealing with the same things. And I think the greater collaboration between cities that are really advancing that climate change science and putting in solutions has huge benefits for both of our countries. There's already an MOU between the city of New Orleans and the city of Havana that could be reactivated and focus on natural disaster preparedness and response and community resilience. And I'm sure there's lots of other cities across the US that could learn from Cuba's long history of responding to hurricanes. I know in the US, coastal and river flooding is one of the largest sources of financial exposure for the federal government, only behind Medicare and Social Security. We're expecting cost from storm-related events, flooding and winds to exceed $54 billion a year. So it's financially smart to take these actions from our point of view. And also, we're going to see more and more people who are personally impacted by these events over time. So I think there's great potential, and we can start over Zoom for now.
Someone in the chat mentioned Law 85, which is the law of forestry. Also, Reynaldo Funes has written a lot about deforestation in Cuba over the centuries and reforestation efforts in the last several decades. So there's a lot there. Perhaps when Orlando is back this afternoon, he can talk a bit more about what he was saying before he was cut off. We have maybe time for one more question. We do have a comment from Lucy Davies of Cuba-Us Travel. Lucy basically just said they are looking ways to support some of the projects that have been discussed. Her travel agency focuses on ecotourism, which was a growing a growing sector, especially after 2014, and we expect that it will pick back up. So I think groups like Lucy's will be looking for ways to invest and work on the ground, either through the foundation or through other projects directly. It's something that we see in this country a lot of direct giving by people who use our national parks and other public lands to give back. So it's just food for thought, perhaps something we can discuss this afternoon. And Reynaldo, you're next.
Bueno, gracias. Sí, está claro que Cuba no es un paraíso ambiental como casi ningún país lo es, ¿no? Es decir, hay muchos retos, muchas cosas por hacer y ahora quizás nos estamos enfocando más en las cuestiones positivas. Es decir, yo creo que es importante tener en cuenta lo que se ha logrado, lo que se ha hecho. Hay una pregunta que no se ha respondido directamente, que cuál es el balance del neto de la cuestión ambiental dentro del sistema cubano, la sociedad cubana. Esto recoge demasiados elementos, son muchos temas, muchas problemáticas ambientales que dependen de recursos, como mismo decía Dan, por ejemplo, cuestiones de reciclaje, la cuestión del agua. Yo creo que Cuba ha hecho un gran esfuerzo por proveer agua a la población, quizás se ha centrado mucho más en la gran infraestructura y falla más en la pequeña infraestructura que llega a los hogares. La Fundación ha tenido programas para atender esos temas, de cómo mejorar los sistemas ya dentro de la vivienda. Son temas que están abiertos para la discusión.
Yes, let's pick that back up this afternoon, perhaps on the next panel. So thanks for everyone who has attended this morning's session. It's been a great discussion. Thanks to the interpreters for sticking with us. Apologies for the technical issues, but this is just a huge change over a year ago. So we're very fortunate to be able to do this. We will take a lunch break. We'll be back at 1:30 Eastern with a very exciting panel on sort of where we go from here. What does an action agenda look like? We'll continue some of these same themes. So come prepared for questions. And I'll invite you to submit questions as the conversations go along. So you don't have to wait till the end, but we'll be back with David Farrer of the American College of Environmental Lawyers and our co-sponsors from Colombia and Cuba. So thank you all again. Any final words, Meg or Gretchen, before we take a break?
No, I just want to thank everyone for their patience. As Dan has said, overcoming the technological problems. Hopefully there'll be a lot of progress in the next year or so in terms of that, not just overcoming environmental challenges.